On August 21st, 1862, Guri Endreson Rosseland and her husband, Lars Rosseland, received visitors. Their farmstead was at Norway Lake, in western Minnesota. This was the frontier, remote and deep in the woods. The visitors were Dakota. Nothing seemed unusual. They had popped by before. Lars Rosseland had shared his food with them during hard winters, and in return, the natives have showed him hunting grounds. It had always been friendly, but this time was different. After shaking hands with Lars Rosseland, they pulled out their guns. Then they shot Lars and his son Ole. After that, they captured two of the Rosseland daughters. Meanwhile, Guri Endreson Rosseland was hiding in the root cellar behind the house, and she was there with her youngest daughter. This episode is about the woman often being referred to as the heroine of Kandiyohi County. And it's about Norwegian settlers caught up in the Dakota War. It's often being said that every big change leaves a trail of loss. That was certainly also true where European settlers came to North America. Before the Europeans showed up, there may have been as many as 10 million native people in present-day US. By 1900, only about 250,000 were left. Some were killed by guns, others by germs. Many natives also starved to death because their food sources were disrupted. It was one of the most extreme demographic collapses in recorded history. And of course, they didn't just lose people. They also lost land, culture, and a way of life. Other people are better equipped to tell that story than I am. I want to zero in on the Norwegian involvement in the Dakota War of 1862, also known as the Sioux Uprising. But first, what was the Dakota War? Here is the historian Karl Jakob Skarstein. He has written a book titled Krigen mot Siouene, Nordmenn mot indianerne, 1862 til 1863, which could be translated as The War Against the Sioux, Norwegians Against the Indians, 1862 to 1863.
They were part of a number of wars between white settlers that were moving west in America and getting into conflict with the original inhabitants, the Native Americans living in these areas.
But the conflict didn't erupt the moment the Europeans set foot in their territory. The tension built up gradually.
When white settlement moved into Minnesota, they were first, they traded a lot with them, and they took some of the Native Americans' lands, but and made treaties and promised them food and other resources in return as payment. And gradually, the Dakotas, that they call this the people living in this area, they were directed into reservations, areas where they were supposed to stay, and in contact with Indian agents sent by the government to give them food and resources. But this system was often plagued by corruption, and much of the supplies that were supposed to go to the Native Americans were used for profit by the agents instead. And the Native Americans, the Dakotas, got more and more angry, and eventually some of them decided to rebel against this treatment, and but there was a lot of division among the Native Americans as well. That some of them probably realized that there was no hope in fighting the white man, and decided to try to find some accommodation or blend in with them in some way instead.
In his book, Skarstein describes the split among the Dakota. Many of the older chiefs wanted peace with the white settlers, not because they were more sympathetic toward them, but simply because they thought they were up against an enemy they could not beat. Some of them, such as the Dakota chief Big Eagle, had only a few years earlier traveled to Washington, D.C. At that point, he had been pressured to sell off all the land the Dakota still held north of the Minnesota River, and now, in D.C., he was supposed to sign the deal. The train ride across the country also left a deep impression. He was overwhelmed by the technology he witnessed, but above all, he was overwhelmed by the sheer number of white people. It was more people than he thought existed in the whole wild world. The younger men hadn't seen what Big Eagle saw. When the Civil War broke out, their willingness to fight only grew, and they had every reason to be frustrated. Promises weren't kept, and federal resources were pulled away. Much of the government's money, food, and manpower went to the Union Army, and little sympathy was shown to the Dakota. In August 1862, when Dakota leaders pleaded for food, trader Andrew Merrick infamously said, "Let them eat grass." This escalated the tension further. And because of the Civil War, many young natives might also have thought that this was the right moment to strike. As many frontier soldiers had been sent south, the military presence in Minnesota didn't look quite as intimidating as before. In some ways, you could say that the uprising started on August 17, 1862. On their way back home from a failed hunt, 4 young Dakota stopped near a settler homestead. They challenged a few white men there to a shooting contest, which the settlers accepted. They took turns firing at the target set on a stump. While the settlers waited to reload, the Dakota quickly reloaded and turned their guns on the men and on one of their wives. After the bloodshed, war was inescapable. Even the cautious older chiefs had no choice but to join the younger rebels.
They kind of realized that there was no way back, so they would just went ahead trying to. I don't know how much of a coherent plan they had, but in general, I guess they tried to push the white settlements out of at least western and central Minnesota.
Norwegians hadn't been the ones sitting across the table when treaties were forced on the Dakota. But after 1851, they, along with Germans and other Europeans, poured into the western and central Minnesota. In the process, they took over old hunting grounds. One of the places they claimed was Norway Lake, in present-day Candioi County.
So it was a very new settlement, and the people there lived very scattered, long distances between them. I guess they hope to lay stake to very huge areas. I guess that must be the reason why they lived so far apart. It seems like in this Norway Lake area that there were mostly Scandinavian settlers, but the first man who came there, probably the first man who came there, was Anglo-American named Solomon Foote. And there are 2 lakes in the areas that are named on Solomon Lake and Foot Lake, named after him.
Mm.
But he was closely in touch with the Scandinavians. So it's quite different from the other settlements I read about, Norwegian Americans who participated in the Civil War. They mostly came from settlements in Wisconsin and Illinois that where people had lived for a couple of decades. So that was more, what you say, developed areas.
Mm.
So this was more like isolated cabins in the woods with their fields around, and they were not frequently in touch with more bigger settlements or towns in the areas because they were far away. So they were very isolated in many ways. So I think they must have been quite brave people in a way to settle like that in this, to them, wilderness. It's not strictly speaking correct to call it wilderness because the Native Americans used that land in and shaped maybe the nature in some ways that the white settlers didn't notice.
And Norway Lake was obviously a community consisting of a lot of Norwegians, also some Scandinavians, more broadly. Where did these Norwegian come from?
They came from different parts of Norway. There were some from eastern Norway, the valleys in eastern Norway, and there were some from western Norway, from Hardanger in western Norway, and yeah, I think that would mostly cover it.
And they mostly
Mm.
had like farmer and let's say cotter's background. Is that a fair
Yeah,
description?
yeah, they were farmers. They came to farm the land and left Norway because of mostly because they wanted more land to to farm. Yeah.
Among the Norwegians who came looking for land were Guri Endreson Rosseland and her husband, Lars Rosseland, and their kids. The sources on them are sparse, but we do know quite a bit.
We know they came from the farm where they got the name Rosseland, which is quite it's quite a scenic location. It's today it's on the plateau above a waterfall. The waterfall today is a tourist attraction called Steinsdalsfossen, near Norheimsund in Hardanger. Well known because you can walk behind the waterfall, so it's very popular. But just above there, there's a plateau, and there is the Rosseland farm with a nice view down the valley towards Norheimsund and the Hardanger fjord and the Folgefonna Glacier on the other side. So it's a pretty place, but you could also tell it's not a lot of room on this plateau to farm the land. So there are some limitations on on how much output they could get from the farms. So it was probably a tough job to survive for at least as the families expanded.
Hmm. And the Rosseland family had indeed expanded quite a bit. All in all, Guri Endreson Rosseland gave birth to 9 kids, 7 girls and 2 boys. There was, however, a family of 6 that left for America. One of the girls stayed behind, another one had passed away the year before they made the journey, and one was yet to be born. After arriving in America, the 46-year-old Guri gave birth once more to a daughter named Anna. Life as settlers must have been tough, but they managed. They built the cabin, still standing today, by the way, and they raised livestock. By 1862, they had 17 cattle, 8 sheep, 8 pigs, and a flock of hens. That was likely enough to feed the 5 children still at home. Their oldest daughter, Gjertrud, lived nearby with her Norwegian husband, Asbjørn Rykkje. And as much as they must have missed the dramatic landscape of Western Norway, they were probably also thrilled with the wide stretches of farmable land. And by all accounts, they also went pretty well along with the old original stewards of the land.
We know that they interacted a bit with the Native Americans there, and that it was common for the Native Americans to come to their cabins when they were hungry, when the hunting had failed, and then they would get some food, and the relations seemed quite well. At least that's, of course, we only have the Norwegians and the Swedes and Anglo-Americans version of the story. So And naturally, they wouldn't have told us if they treated the Native Americans in a disrespectful way, or sometimes. So they might have made it look better than it was. But certainly, it seems there were occasions where they interacted quite peacefully, and probably it was to some mutual advantage that the Native Americans told them something about hunting in the area and good routes, paths to follow, and stuff like that. So it probably was some reciprocity there.
But by mid-August 1862, the days of reciprocity were over. After the incident where 5 settlers were killed, things rapidly escalated.
So at this time, most of the Native American warriors, they were going down the Minnesota River, fighting the soldiers there at Fort Ridgely, and trying to push them out. But some smaller bands went northward to the area called Big Woods. Norway Lake is on the western outskirts of these big woodlands, and probably went to drive the settlers out, and also probably for plunder, and probably like I mean, any other time when young people go into rebellion, and they do it for different reasons. There are different, some you could say some good people, some bad people, some for you could say nobler reasons than others. So some probably just went for the plunder and the killing, and others to drive them out and reclaim the land. So I guess we can be quite, and also to show off, which was probably important to some of them, these young men. So and of course a lot of frustration, just the need to get the frustration out of having been humiliated and cheated by the Indian agents for so long.
On August 21st, several days into the uprising, you might think that the Rosselands would have heard about it, but they hadn't, simply because they lived so far away from everything.
So they were pretty much by themselves, deep in the woods, you could say. So of course, if somebody by accident had been closer to where the uprising started and gone in that direction, they might have heard about it, but they hadn't. So the only ones who could have told them were probably the Native Americans, but they had they had other intentions.
But at first, the intentions of the 4 Dakota men weren't obvious. They acted just as they had on earlier visits.
Yeah, they seem to use some different methods at different places, but they would like at when I arrived at Rosseland farm, they first shook hands with the family, and then suddenly, just without warning, pulled out their guns and started shooting.
Yeah.
So they shot Guri Rosseland's husband. He was killed almost instantly, and one of his sons was shot in the shoulder and left for dead. And but that also gave Guri time to grab her youngest daughter, the 3-year-old, and run behind the house and hide in a cellar beneath the house. And from there, she witnessed. There were probably some cracks between so she could look out and saw the Indians grab her other daughters. I think they were 13 and 10. And she had to listen them when they cried for help, cried for her to help them, which of course there was nothing she could do. And then they were carried away.
Why wouldn't they just kill them?
We see that this happened in many cases with the settler women, and it could have been for like a kind of trophy, and but also some of them were victims of rape and mistreatment, and so as with the attacks in general, there are probably different motives for doing this, but and probably also as hostages.
So they could use it as a bargaining chip later on, potentially, or
probably, yeah.
Guri and her daughter hid in the root cellar behind the house until darkness fell. Then they ran into the forest.
Of course, it's impossible to imagine what it must have been like for her to have been witness to that tragedy, and at the same time trying to figure out how she could help her youngest daughter survive. She would need food, and so at dawn, she came through this night. Must have been a very resilient woman, and she returned to the house and found some milk. All the other things had been plundered for her daughter, and then and then found her son that had been shot in the shoulder, and the Indians had left him for dead, but it turned out that he was still alive.
The bullet that tore through his shoulder had left him badly wounded. According to Guri Endreson's later testimony, he was nearly out of his mind with pain and fear when she found him. After he was shot the day before, he had lain completely still on the ground. And when one of the Dakota rolled him over, he gave no sign of life. That, in the end, was what saved him. Guri immediately started to dress his wounds.
Probably a fortunate thing that she was quite an old woman with a long life behind her in Hardanger and in the new land with under difficult circumstances. So she probably had learned herself quite a lot about taking care of injuries and stuff like that. So I think she must have been. We see that later on that she probably washed the wound and bandaged it and did things that, with their somewhat limited knowledge of healthcare compared to ours, at least she probably had some common sense approach to this, and so that probably helped a lot in this situation.
Her son Ole recovered, but to her great grief, she realized she had still lost the son the day before.
An older son had returned after visiting some neighboring place, had returned during the killings and had been killed by the Native Americans without Guri seeing it. So she probably discovered later that he was killed also. So she then decided to go to her daughter and son-in-law's house, Rishi's house, that was some distance further east.
Guri Rosseland had no time to lose. She couldn't even bury her loved ones. Instead, she rounded up a few oxen the Dakota hadn't taken, hitched them to a sleigh, and placed her two children on board while she walked alongside. It wasn't just Ole who was suffering. Her daughter was hungry, and after a night in the woods, her face was so swollen with mosquito bites it was almost unrecognizable. When they arrived at Gjertrud and Asbjørn Riches farm, Ole went ahead to check while Guri and little Anna hid in the forest. He saw a wagon outside he didn't recognize, a haystack burning, and inside the house he heard an unfamiliar voice. He rushed back and told his mother what he'd seen. They decided it was safest to stay away for now. For the rest of the day, they went from farm to farm, only to find each and one abandoned. The next day, Guri herself set out to check on the Riches place.
She kind of comes to what we could call a little battlefield or something, that where because several people had gathered at the son-in-law's house because they had received warning that an uprising was underway. And this early settler, Solomon Foote, clearly a resourceful man, he kind of led the defense, but he was, when the Native Americans attacked, he was wounded several times and eventually unable to help fighting. So then his wife and Asbjørn Rysje and his wife resisted, but then Asbjørn Rysje also was wounded. So it was the women that fought off the attack. But and both of the men were so badly injured that they could hardly move. There were also some Swedish families in the house, but at least according to the statements of the Norwegians, they and Anglo-American narratives, they were unable. The men were so shocked and that they were unable to resist properly, and they left the day following the attack. So when Guri arrived, there were just the two wounded men. The others had then gone off for help or just to flee in the case of the Swedes. So then Guri comes and she bandages the two men, cleans their wounds, and decides right away that she has to get them away from there. So she is in some way able to carry her son-in-law up to the wagon and pushing up. She uses a plank like some kind of ramp and managed to push him onto the wagon. And fortunately, Solomon Foot was, with a lot of support, able to move to the wagon, and they got underway. In that way, she saved her both Solomon Foot and her son-in-law.
Realizing there might be safety in numbers, Guri headed east towards Forest City, the largest town in the area. Along the way, they passed burning farms and families who had suffered the same fate as their own.
They find the bodies of some Swedes that has been killed, and at one point they see some feathers in the bushes and are afraid that they're going to be attacked by the Native Americans. But it turns out that it's just some kind of birds. I think maybe it was turkey and hawks. I think it was. So she eventually manages to get to Forest City, and there she gets a wonderful surprise. It turns out that her two daughters that were taken as hostages or whatever, they had managed to escape, so they were already in Forest City. So after all the tragedy, at least there was some good news there.
After the tragedy, Guri spent some time on a neighboring farm, and eventually she moved back to her farmstead. In a letter written 4 years later, she described how hard it was to return, and how the old farmstead was forever stained with bad memories. That same letter recounts the horrific events of 1862. It contains some discrepancies compared to other accounts, and it seems like she tried to downplay her own actions and deeds. Some have also suggested that the inconsistencies may stem from the fact that she didn't write the letter herself, as she was illiterate and had it dictated. Either way, it's clear that the tragic events were not something she wanted to dwell on.
She lived until 1881 for 20 more years. But this Anglo-American Solomon Foot, he praised her actions as called her a heroine, but done a great deed. So she was sometimes called a heroine of Candy-Yoai County. But herself, she never didn't seem to like talking about it. So it was probably the huge tragedy she had witnessed that it was an event that she wasn't keen on being reminded of. So she tried to put behind her, you could say. So she made she made no attempt to enter the spotlight as the hero of this event. She just wanted it to be forgotten, I think.
For the Dakota, 1862 was probably also a year many would have liked to have erased from their memory. Hundreds of men were put on trial in rushed military tribunals, and on December 26th, 38 men were hanged in the largest mass execution in US history. Soon after, Congress canceled all treaties with the Dakota, confiscated their lands, and expelled them from Minnesota. Less than 100 years after the European settlers arrived, they had lost it all. Guro Rosseland was hailed as a heroine.
Hmm.
At the same time, in hindsight, some will argue that she was a part of a greater movement that essentially removed the natives from their lands. How do you think that she should be regarded in the history books?
I think it's always a slippery slope to try to pass judgment of people in the past, but I think you can do it to some extent. So, but it's hard to find where you draw the line. So where you could, I think it requires a certain amount of awareness of what you're doing. I think you could admire her resilience and view it a bit in isolation as a mother taking care of her family. And but also not just the family, there are also the Sommerfoot and just so it's you can be impressed by her fortitude and resilience and but I think we could to in our day I think it's too rare that we try to keep several thoughts at the same time, and I think we should do this in this case, that you can on one hand say that what she did were from some points of view admirable, but while at the same time recognizing that she also represented something that could be viewed in a negative light.
In his book, Skarstein also points out that Guri and the other Norwegians were to some extent pawns in someone else's game. Most of them had come to America simply to farm. And the conflict didn't erupt just because Norwegians and other Europeans moved into the Midwest, although that was certainly a part of it. It erupted because the natives were cheated and mistreated by greedy land agents.
I think these are the really bad people. They are those who really actively cheat the Native Americans out of their lands. So, so I think the Norwegian immigrants, for the most part, here are not the main bad people, but should could have to some greater extent have remembered that the Native Americans were their fellow men, and according to the way the very religious Norwegians, they should have treated them as human beings.
My final question is what is always my final question because this podcast is about Norwegians that in some way changed America. So I guess my question is how, how did Guri Rosseland change America?
Well, as we said, she was part of this great westward movement, and also great part of the Norwegian influence in this area. So she may have raised awareness of the Norwegian presence to some extent, and that was important. I mean, one reason advanced for the Norwegians participating in the Civil War, for instance, was exactly that they needed visibility. That many Americans mixed them with Germans, and what was this thing about Scandinavians? They weren't sure. So, from a Norwegian point of view, there were very many Norwegian immigrants, but at this point there were like 60,000 at this point when the uprising took place, and that's not a huge number in the millions of people living in America. So they wanted to be noticed also in order to be able to participate in politics, and as more and more Norwegians did following this. So even though Guri Rosseland didn't do it, she may have helped in a little bit to raise awareness that when her story became known that about Norwegian presence in America to some extent, and also perhaps also helped advancing this perception of the Norwegians as resilient, hardy, hardworking people.
My name is Frederick Kalstveit, and this podcast was made in conjunction with Vesterheim and with the support from Norway House Foundation in San Francisco. The music you hear in the background was made by Jan Skoglund.